All right. Well, to start with the currency series, I've been told that it's anything but concise.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
But yes, I'm hoping that I will bring all of these articles together in a book once the series is finished. But to get back to your question, yes, I started my PhD in 2012 at the University of the Free State under the supervision of, really excellent mentors in Professor Ian Femister and other people who were on the supervisory team, one of them being Andy Cohen. And my thesis examined finance during Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence. Now, I must mention that there's a broader background to this because even from my honors, I've always been interested in money and finance. And, my honors dissertation examined the Small Enterprises Development Corporation and its efforts in trying to finance small to medium scale enterprises in Zimbabwe, particularly, on the backdrop of the attainment of independence in Zimbabwe. SEDCO was created in 1983, and the discourses around those times were focusing particularly on issues of colonial redress, of including African business people and financing their businesses as they had been excluded by the colonial system. And that's what I initially looked at. But my interest in money grew even stronger. And this happened around 2004 onwards when I was called back to become a teaching assistant at the University of Zimbabwe in the Department of Economic History. And as you will recall, around that time, Gideon Gono had been appointed as the Reserve Bank governor.
Yeah.
Yes, the governor of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. And I remember, there was so much prominence after Gideon Gono's appointment on monetary policies, especially given that Zimbabwe was undergoing hyperinflation. So we would sit around, and at one of those times, I sat in the Department of Economic History with colleagues and with some of my lecturers. Dr. Mtisi was among those people, and we were listening to the radio to one of Gono's monetary policies. But I remember coming out of the office after the presentation had been finished, wondering what the hell Gono was talking about because I didn't understand much of it.
Oh, yeah.
And yet this was something that was supposed to be affecting all of us. So my interest in trying to understand what this concept of money really grew. And I ended up proposing to do a topic on monetary policy statements because I was very curious to do this. I eventually found out that it was very, very difficult. And through the guidance of people like, Dr. Mtisi and Dr. Machinga Idze, who eventually became my MA supervisor, he advised me to just try to trace where the original concept of money in Zimbabwe came from. So this led me to write this MA dissertation, which examined the establishment and operation of a colonial monetary system. And that led me to go to the archives to start researching this, eventually coming up with a dissertation that looked at the monetary developments in Zimbabwe between 1890 and 1938. And the reason for looking at this particular period was because from 1890 to 1938, there was no monetary authority in Zimbabwe. And I decided to examine until the establishment of the Southern Rhodesia Currency Board that was established in 1938. So for my PhD, I felt on expanding on this particular area. But the area that got my attention was actually looking at the experiences of UDI Rhodesia and the developments that occurred in the monetary sphere. Between 1962 and 1979, so not quite UDI, so just before UDI when the Rhodesian Front came to power, because the Rhodesian Front came to power in December 1962. And of course, Ian Smith took over from Winston Field in 1964 because Winston Field was the first prime minister of, the Rhodesian Front government in 62. So it's really looking at the monetary changes that took place between 62 and 79, which are issues that I think we can discuss as we proceed. But that's what my thesis examined. How did UDI Rhodesia manage its economy, manage its finances, despite international ostracism, United Nations sanctions, and war? And I'm looking at it in a context whereby it posted, I think, possibly the most productive decade in all of Zimbabwean history between 1960 and 1970. And this was despite all of the challenges that it faced. And although it did not maintain the same trajectory of growth as it had until 1970, it still performed relatively better than most of the other countries in the region, such as Zambia and Malawi, which had by now become independent and which had been its former partners in the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. And that was actually fascinating, despite that, the fact that it was experiencing the escalating liberation struggle in Zimbabwe.
Oh, I see. That was quite a profound experience. I've just recalled the time that you said that Gideon Gono had been appointed as the governor of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. I remember at that time I was in primary school, but the most interesting thing was that I was in primary school.
You're making me feel old.
I was in primary school, but I was a billionaire.
Yes.
I was a billionaire because of the hyperinflation that was, occurring in the country. And then all of a sudden, I found myself that I didn't have anything at all.
Yes, so you were a poor billionaire in many ways.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
So it is exactly those dynamics that led me to want to understand, how all of these things work. Where do they come from? How have they developed over time? And to what extent can we use the history of these developments to understand what is happening in contemporary Zimbabwe today?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I've been examining some of your articles that are around the very same topic of money and banking, and particularly the article that appeared in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History that is entitled Money, Banking, and the Rhodesia's Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And it appears that you did conduct some research, some archival research at the Bank of England, at the National Archives of Zimbabwe, at the Central Archival Repository that is in Pretoria, and at Corey Library at Rhodes University. What kind of sources are available in these archives?
Well, there are quite a number of sources, varied sources, really. So I will say that there was some material that I found from the University of Zimbabwe, but it wasn't quite sufficient, I would say. But, some cabinet proceedings, and many of these, I think the most illustrative came from the Corey Library at Rhodes University, where cabinet proceedings, which have been called the Smith Papers, were located. I understand that now some of them have been moved, or rather, maybe the original copies, I'm not so sure what it is, that has been moved to the National Archives of Zimbabwe. But I know at Rhodes University, they still have copies of the so-called Smith Papers. And in these Smith Papers, you will find that there are the cabinet proceedings are very illustrative in terms of how the Rhodesian government managed its economy. In particular, in 1964, the Rhodesian Front government created a cabinet committee that was called the Ministerial Economic Coordination Committee, the MECC, which was headed by the Minister of Finance, who was then John James Rathau. But it was a coordination committee which brought in all line ministries. So the ways in which it worked was such that the minister obviously would have a budget, right? But that budget and that would eventually be read out as, Rhodesian fiscal policy, was informed by discussions that had taken place within the MECC. So they would write to each other about what each ministry required financially. So whether it's the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Mining, the Ministry of Trade, Customs and Excise, whatever it was, they had to coordinate all of the financial requirements of all of these line ministries. But it wasn't just up to the Minister of Finance. It's unlike what the situation you have in Zimbabwe, where the Minister of Finance performs a pseudo prime ministerial position and he becomes the savior of the economy. No.
Yeah.
In this particular case, whatever the requirements of each of these line ministries, they had to then sit down and look at the strategic priorities of the economy. And these were the ways in which the budget was then decided. From the Bank of England, I found, material that was connected to what was happening in Zimbabwe, but particularly in relation to imperial sterling versus the Rhodesian colonial currency system. So, to give you a brief history of this, just so you understand the material that I encountered or that I used from the Bank of England. From 1890 to 1965, the colonial Zimbabwe used currency that was directly linked to sterling. So by 1965, this currency was 100% linked to sterling. In other words, it was not floating currency like what we have now, right? It was 100% fully covered. So whatever fluctuations that took place on sterling took place on the Zimbabwean currency. And in fact, we didn't have a currency until 1932 when the Coinage and Currency Act was passed, right? And it was only until 1938 when the Southern Rhodesia Currency Board was put in place. And of course, the Federal Reserve Bank, which was then created in 1956 for the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. So, in essence, the currency that was used in Southern Rhodesia and in Northern Rhodesia and in Nyasaland was principally British currency. But when Rhodesia went, for its unilateral declaration of independence in 1965, it was then expelled from sterling.
Okay.
You understand?
Okay,
Yes.
yeah.
So when it was expelled from sterling, it needed to come up with a currency of its own that was in no way linked to British sterling.
Oh, yeah.
And the documents that I found at the Bank of England speak to this challenge that the British government faced and the Bank of England faced as they were trying to put pressure on Southern Rhodesia to capitulate because of its UDI. And therefore, the correspondence that you find is correspondence between, for example, Bank of England officials, people from the Treasury, and people from the Imperial and Commonwealth Office. So that's the kind of information you'd find, and you'd see the kind of strategies that they put in place. And you'd be surprised that when the Bank of England learnt about Rhodesia's attempts, to try and create a territorial monetary system, they put in place a mechanism to try and make sure that Rhodesia would fail. And they called this blacksmith, right? I'm sure you found some of that in the paper that you mentioned. And they realized that Rhodesia was planning to do this when it started withdrawing a lot of the resources from the Bank of England itself. Now, once UDI was passed, the Bank of England actually suspended the Reserve Bank of Rhodesia, right? Of course, it couldn't physically do that, particularly because, the Bank of, the Reserve Bank of Rhodesia was located in the colony. But they did so because it was affiliated to the Bank of England, and they formed an alternative Reserve Bank of Rhodesia in London, where they then froze whatever amounts were held at the Bank of Rhodesia. So most of the material that you find at the Reserve Bank of at the Bank of England has to do with how they then tried to manage the frozen monies that were kept at the Bank of England, and how they tried to prevent the Reserve Bank of Rhodesia from succeeding, right, by a number of mechanisms. Among these things include, for example, moving against the printing of money by a company called Bradbury and Wilkinson in London. And when the Rhodesians moved to have their notes printed in Germany, the Bank of England actually went ahead and sued that particular company in Germany to try and stop them from printing notes for the rebellious colony. Yes, particularly because Rhodesia was under United Nations sanctions. So it's some of these things that they had to deal with. And among the other things were British investors who had invested in Rhodesian bonds, right, who were trying to recover their money. But because Rhodesia had suspended the payment of all debt in response to the sanctions against it, those investors, most of whom were from the southeast parts of London, actually sued the Bank of England for them to unfreeze Rhodesian money and pay those investors that money. So, there was a court case which came to be known as the Franklin case after the person who led what became the Rhodesian Bondholders Association, for example, in trying to recover their money. So there's very fascinating material about the dynamics of severing imperial and colonial monetary connections, right? And the ways in which the colony went about putting in place a territorial monetary system, and the empire went about trying to manage the Rhodesian rebellion from a monetary perspective. And some of what I've just mentioned are parts of the issues that I examine in my PhD thesis.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. That's so interesting. These are archives that are very, very worth examining and investigating. Well, so now, provided the case that there are actually so many other articles around this very same topic, including the works that you have written, that have advanced the argument that the period that is between the imposition of UDI in 1965 up until the late 1970s is described as the period in which Rhodesia experienced massive strides towards rapid industrialization and production in the economy. This has been argued by so many economic historians, so many economists. But this comes against a background of the sanctions that were imposed by the United Nations and the British government. It comes against a background of the Liberation War that started just a year after the UDI was imposed.
Yes.
What were the specific monetary economic policies that were implemented by the government of Smith during this time to try and encourage production in the economy and to try and survive the sanctions that were imposed?
Okay, yes. Very interesting question. Let me start by mentioning that monetary policy was not quite as prominent as it is today in Zimbabwe. Yes. In fact, from the archives that from the archival material I have, you don't see too much reference to, speeches by the Reserve Bank governor, who was between 1964 and, if I'm not mistaken, until 1976, Bruce Noel, that was his name. But you do see him being sort of consulted when they changed the name of the Rhodesian pound from the Rhodesian pound to the Rhodesian dollar when they decimalized in 1970, but not much else. Most of the policies to do with managing currency were actually managed through the Ministerial Economic Coordination Committee, the MECC. Not even, it wasn't a primary duty of the Minister of Finance himself. So it was really a coordination effect, you see. So this is how they managed currency. Now, like I said, they were operating in a context of a rebellion, right? Remember, this is a colony that is trying to maintain white rule and trying to delay as much as possible the onset of majority rule. And to do this, they implemented the unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. Now, one of the major challenges that Rhodesia anticipated was the fact that the measures that would be laid out, that would be put in place by Britain, included, among others, the blacksmith that I've mentioned from the Bank of England, which involved expulsion from sterling, freezing of all Rhodesian financial assets that were held in Britain, and through United Nations sanctions from 66, which were extended in 68, across Europe as well. Now, crucially, as other studies have demonstrated, Rhodesia had been dependent on British and after the 1940s Commonwealth markets as well. So, for example, the major export that came from Southern Rhodesia was tobacco. That was sold to Britain because of I think it was the Tobacco Agreement of 1948. And that was the major revenue earner. I'm not talking about foreign currency here, particularly because of the 100% link. So it was the major revenue earner. And for most of its other products, whether it was sugar or whatever it was, they enjoyed Commonwealth preferences. Now, in 1965, as part of the measures that Britain used to try and force Rhodesia to capitulate, all of those preferences were removed. And in fact, embargoes were put in place. Embargoes on tobacco, embargoes on sugar, even embargoes on the importation of oil. You see? So all of these were measures that were put in place to ensure that Rhodesia would collapse. And to quote the words of British Prime Minister then, who was Harold Wilson, this was meant to ensure that Rhodesia would collapse in a matter of weeks rather than months, which is something that I've seen you write in your own work, citing that very popular quotation. And it's also the subject of, books that have been published about this as well. But the Smith regime had realized this, well, maybe not the Smith regime, but rather the Rhodesian Front government had realized that this was likely to happen in the event of a UDI from when they came into power in December 1962. So from the article that you cite, I actually, trace how the Rhodesian Front government began preparing for UDI as soon as they attained power. And you have to remember that they attained power in protest to what they thought was white liberalism that would have given way to black majority rule, which they didn't want to happen immediately. So that's why they split away from that party and formed the Rhodesian Front Party. And one of the measures they put in place in preparing for UDI was to actually, these were geopolitical arrangements, to actually get into an alliance with like-minded countries that wanted to maintain white rule within the region. So in 1964, for example, they got into a trade agreement with Portugal. And remember, Portugal, under Antonio Salazar at that time, had colonies in, I think it's Guinea, Angola, Mozambique, and so forth. And Salazar's Estado Novo regime actually wanted to maintain its colonies despite, the winds of change, the so-called winds of change that everybody talks about, despite imperial retreat by some of the major European powers. South Africa, at that time, had just declared itself a republic in 1961 and were keen on maintaining the apartheid system in place. So when Rhodesia got into an alliance with these two countries, they both they got both into strategic military alliances, they got into strategic economic alliances and political alliances as well in 1964, and they created what became known as the Pretoria-Salisbury-Lisbon axis. And if you look at the nature of the agreement, it had a very strong impact on the currency. In other words, they managed to diversify their trade and their geopolitical connections. They shifted from depending on Commonwealth markets to utilizing this axis to find other outlets for their products. So really, what my work does is to demystify this notion of what we call money and this concentration of this thing called monetary policy. For me, money is not so much the currency that you actually hold in your pocket, whether it's a US dollar and actual paper money. This means to me nothing. Or is the bank balance that you have in your account. Money is simply, currency is simply a representation of the kind of economic activities that are taking place in your economy, and the Rhodesians knew this. So this is why they diversified their trade, they diversified their alliances, and they looked for new markets. And in fact, even after they were expelled from sterling, for them it wasn't a train smash because it was not so much about the currency or where it was anchored on, but what they were able to produce and market and how they were able to maintain the value of whatever it is that was circulating in their economy. And for me, this was the trick to Rhodesian success. Now, if you want to juxtapose that against what's happening in Zimbabwe today, they completely miss the point as far as I'm concerned. They concentrate on this. They want to make sure or give the impression that their currency has value. You will remember when the Reserve Bank governor, Mangudya, was challenged a few years ago when he was bringing back a version of the US dollars when he initially brought in bond coins and ultimately bond notes. He was told that this would not work. And I think I was among some of those people who wrote op-eds mentioning this point, trying to direct them to the idea that they were missing the point. And I remember what he said was that failure is not an option. If this currency doesn't work, I'll resign, to which he didn't. Right? You will remember Mnangagwa, I think it was an interview that he gave where he was boasting that we have the strongest currency in the region.
Yeah, I remember that.
You remember that?
Yeah.
And I was busy thinking that it's not about that, right? You look at Japan today, right? And you look at the Japanese yen. It's one of the most productive economies in the world, right? And yet, when you look at the value of its currency against the US dollar, even against the Zim bond note then, it doesn't hold up. You look at the Chinese yen, right? This is the point, in my view, that the Rhodesians understood. They understood that it wasn't about the actual currency itself, but it was about what you were able to do for the people in the economy in terms of the standard of life. It was what we were able to do in terms of what you produced and what you brought into the country. And this is what they did. They made strategic geopolitical arrangements with the alliances that they made with Portugal, with South Africa, and they utilized those routes, whether it was Mozambique or South Africa, to export their products despite the embargo, right? And they made sure that they had in place an effective exchange control system that ensured that they didn't import things that were unnecessary. Unlike what you see today, where elites bring in these Lamborghinis and these very expensive vehicles. Right? Particularly because they hold positions of power. I'm not saying that the Rhodesians were not as corrupt as people you find in Zimbabwe today, but when you're comparing those two dispensations, you can't help but notice the difference in the commitment that the MECC, for example, had in terms of managing the economy and what the ZANU-PF government is doing today. There is no coordination taking place whatsoever. These guys work completely at cross purposes. And of course, given the events of what has been happening recently with the arrest of Chingono, Ngarivume, and other activists that have been protesting against corruption, then you get to realize that these guys don't really quite understand how economies work and are in power only for self-aggrandizement. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe I'm taking it a little bit too far.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I see. Thank you very much for that response, Prof. Nyamunda. Let's talk about the sanctions themselves. I've noticed from the readings that I've done so far that there are other alternative explanations. There are other nationalist historians who have argued that the sanctions that were imposed on the government of Ian Smith were not necessarily effectively implemented as compared to what's happening today, or what's happening with the sanctions that we have in other countries, and including in Zimbabwe in the modern day. They've argued that there were so many fundamental and structural weaknesses in as much as the application of these sanctions were concerned. Some of them have cited that the oil embargo was never effected. Some of them have argued that the top industrialized countries, both in Africa and the Western countries, including the United States and Britain, would clandestinely import from Rhodesia regardless of the sanctions that were imposed. Now, against evidence that is found by these historians and by these writers, would it be fair to say that Ian Smith was a genius in terms of managing the economy in a time of crisis, in a time of sanctions, or he was simply a man who was able to take advantage of the weaknesses in the application of the sanctions?
Yes, a very interesting question again, but I wouldn't put it down just to Ian Smith. Certainly, the government he led recognized that they could navigate these sanctions by utilizing a number of opportunities that were available to them, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're asking this question about sanctions during UDI and juxtaposing it against sanctions against the Zimbabwean government today, and trying to see what the difference is. So let me, I hope I'll answer that question effectively.
Okay.
First, let's start by looking at the UN itself. I think it's 75 years old, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to check that. The UN consists of a number of member countries, and not all countries are members to it. And at different times, it had, a differential impact in terms of how it approached conflicts across the world. And, it hasn't always been successful. Certainly, during Rhodesian times, one of the reasons why sanctions were imposed against Rhodesia was because it was regarded a threat to global peace. And usually those are the conditions under which sanctions would be applied, right? But sanctions can never be fully effective, particularly because not all the countries share similar interests. So even a pariah state is going to have allies who share similar interests with it. In the context of Rhodesia during UDI, I've just mentioned the Pretoria-Lisbon-Salisbury axis.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So you have Portugal pulling in a different direction to other European countries that are accepting that majority rule is inevitable, right? And it is holding on to Mozambique as one of its colonies, which neighbors Southern Rhodesia, right? You've got South Africa, which has declared itself a republic in 1961. I don't know whether it was in response to Macmillan's Winds of Change speech, or, and, there were a number of other things happening in South Africa at that time also, but certainly their interests are in maintaining white rule within the region, right? So when sanctions are imposed in 1965, Rhodesia has partners in Portugal and in South Africa. And remember, South Africa was very influential in the South African Customs Union, which included Southwest Africa, which became Namibia later on, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, and so forth. So it had influence in all of these areas. And, it was also involved in Angola, and it had all of these trade partners. And one of the reasons that Britain was hesitant, for example, to apply pressure fully on South Africa was particularly because South Africa was actually one of its biggest African trade partners. So in this context, what you realize is that sanctions can never be fully effective, whether during Rhodesian times or Zimbabwean times, right? So there is that. And certainly there is also a situation whereby you're dealing with personalities and you're dealing with a number of people who busted sanctions on behalf of the Rhodesians, who by themselves had networks in Britain itself. If you remember the Oilgate scandal, right?
Exactly.
Now, the example you gave about oil, they were what were called Friends of Rhodesia. So even where the oil could no longer come through the pipeline in Mozambique because of the, what was it called, that blockade, where the British ships patrolled, it still could bring in oil from South Africa, for example. So it could never have been fully effective. And companies such as British Petroleum, have been found to have been complicit in bringing oil into Rhodesia. But there are other dynamics as well. I'll give you one important example in the context of Rhodesia. Rhodesia had among the purest chrome in the world. And chrome was required, for example, in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s in the United States armament industry. Remember, it was involved in the war with Vietnam, I think 63 to the 1970s. Yeah. And because you don't find chrome all over the world, there are only a few countries in which chrome is mined. The Americans ended up importing chrome from the USSR. And remember, the USSR was a Cold War foe. Some of the chrome that was sold to the Americans at high prices had actually been bought from the Rhodesians. You see, so the Rhodesians were quite good at playing the geopolitics, right? At navigating the sanctions, like I said, and at looking at those partners whom they wanted to trade with. And this is despite the fact that the Rhodesians were busy trying to suppress the African liberation struggle and utilizing this argument that we are trying to stop communism from spreading within Southern Africa, and yet they are trading with the communist country. So that's navigating sanctions. Now, the Americans realized that they were not winning by putting an embargo on minerals from Rhodesia. And in 1971, they passed what was called the Byrd Amendment. And they decided to import chrome and other strategic minerals from Southern Rhodesia. So in other words, they went against their own sanctions. So it's about how you play the politics. It's about how you navigate the sanctions. And certainly Zimbabwe had quite an opportunity to do that, whether under Mugabe or under Mnangagwa. When Mnangagwa came in through a coup in 2017, he had a lot of goodwill, not just among Zimbabweans, but from people within Europe and the United States as well. But he is responsible for squandering that goodwill himself. He could have utilized connections, that opportunity, which he failed to do even though he went for his global campaigns, to try and improve trade relations, right? He could have utilized regional geopolitical relations with either South Africa and other like-minded countries, just like Mugabe himself, but they never thought in that way. Part of the reason is particularly because the people in government at the moment are not thinking in all of these terms that I'm talking about. They are more concerned about maintaining power, and they're utilizing access to economic resources to sustain that power through a patronage network where you have people who support you particularly because of what they stand to benefit from you. So for them, the economy is not as central as it was to the Rhodesians. For the Rhodesians, for them to maintain power, the economy had to do well. For the Zimbabweans, for them to maintain power, it's more about suppressing dissent more than it is about making sure that the economy is performing well. And if I am incorrect and the economy is at the forefront of their mind, then they suffer from a poverty of ideas of how to make it operate. And this is why in some of these articles that I write, I suggest that they could pluck a page from the Rhodesians playbook.
Yeah, exactly.
Despite, these different scenarios, they could utilize, for example, the work that the MECC did, right? And try to utilize those coordination efforts to see how best they could work for them. I'm saying this, because this is, just you and I talking. It takes much more than that. But, at the top of my head in responding to you, these are the kind of connections or suggestions that I could make.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
This is interesting, Prof. Nyamunda. It's very interesting because it appears that the successive governments that have presided over the Zimbabwean economy from the time we attained independence in 1980 have tried to identify convenient excuses for the lack of economic growth and for the poor delivery in terms of services. And it appears that after 2002, when these United States and European Union sanctions were imposed, the sanctions mantra has become the most convenient excuse for poor economic growth and development. But still, having this experience of the Rhodesian economy, having rapidly industrialized, created jobs and advanced development in infrastructure during this period when there were sanctions and there was war, what are the sharp differences that can be examined, and what can possibly be done? The differences between the Smith regime in terms of combating the effects of sanctions, and as well as the government of Robert Mugabe and the government of Mnangagwa.
Well, the similarities, I suppose, would be that at both dispensations, there was authoritarianism in place that needed to be, Now, during Smith's time, he was catering to, less than 260, a constituents of less than 266,000 people. And what they were fighting was the maintenance of white rule by denying Africans the franchise, right? But part of their strategy was to retain a vibrant economy. And they did this through some of the strategies that I've just suggested to you. And one of the ways that the liberation fighters sought to defeat Smith was to stretch his regime to its economic limits, right? And by 1979, they had succeeded in doing so for a number of reasons. I mean, the independence of Mozambique in 1975 was a big game changer, but I'm not going to dwell so much on it because this is covered extensively in the literature. So that's how they defeated the Smith regime. When it comes to Mugabe, and very recently Mnangagwa, I suppose the major challenge was taking them out of power. I mean, let's not mince the words here. When it comes to the economy, if you ask me, people talk about the lost decade of the 1980s. My reading of it is that actually they rode on reserves that had been maintained by the Rhodesian government. And once those resources started getting depleted, those financial resources, we then immediately plunged into a crisis. Now that combined with the corrupt activities that many government ministers, and other cronies got involved in, the decline was rapid. Now, what is unfortunate is this was occurring in a context where our thinking about the economy was highly problematic, and this is an area that would require a whole other discussion. Because as far as I'm concerned, I do think that the approach that was taken in managing the economy from the 1980s onwards was highly problematic, and it still is to date. And part of it is something I alluded to earlier, this concentration on fiscal and monetary policy, and thinking that looking at those things and other metrics such as GDP and GNP would be the solution to solving the Zimbabwean problem. For me, that's highly problematic, because the Zimbabwean problem has nothing to do with those kinds of metrics, or putting together a policy that will tell you that we're going to use so much money in the economy, we're going to raise interest rates to this much and so forth. No. The challenge that is in the economy has to do with what we're able to produce, because that's what an economy is after all. What is it that you produce? What is it that you consume? Is there a balance, right? And unfortunately, this is something that seems to be lost on the Zimbabwean government. And I do not think that the Zimbabwean government has the capacity to come up with people who have the capacity to do this. Not least because the idea of interministerial coordination is completely lost on them. And for me, that is essential to us producing what the economy requires to begin to improve. And I'm also worried that they seem to assume that the economy will improve overnight as long as they come up with the right policies. And you hear this from people like Mthuli Ncube and whoever else they put into those ministerial positions, whether it's in the Reserve Bank or in the Ministry of Finance. And the answer is still the same. We should stop deluding ourselves and assuming that the economy is going to recover overnight. That is never going to happen. The second thing is this. I mentioned that Smith catered to a very small constituency. The ZANU-PF government has to deal with a constituency of over 14 million people. Now, while the inequalities during the Rhodesian times are nothing compared to the kind of inequalities we see today. Yes. One of the major problems is that we've maintained the structures, the systems, and the institutions from Rhodesian times. And those are the structures, systems, and institutions that we still want to impose on an economy that is to cater to an expanded majority. That is highly problematic, and that is never going to work. Crucially also, the monetary system during Rhodesian times was anchored, the financial system rather than the monetary system was anchored on production on the land, whether it's mining or agriculture. And this land was privately owned. So to give you a quick example, if I own a farm and I don't have sufficient fluid capital to produce for that year, I will go and borrow money from the bank, but because I own title to that farm, the bank can give me the money, and if I fail to pay it back, they can seize the farm and market it.
The farm. Yeah, exactly.
You see, after land reform, with offer letters, farmers can no longer do that. And therefore, banks cannot be as productive as they used to be, because what they are based on is no longer applicable. So we need to realize that the environment, the financial environment has completely changed. So to continue pursuing policies where you use institutions in the way they were used in the 1970s, in a context of post-land reform, in a context where you're talking about indigenization policies, is never going to work.
Yeah.
So what the government should do is realize that they've put these changes in place, and therefore they need to reimagine a different way of looking at the economy. And this is something that, again, is completely lost on them. So while there have been certain changes over time, the systems institutions and approaches to the economy remain the same. And, they are not fit or do not apply to the trajectory that developments have taken since independence and through the 2000s and through the crisis as well. So for those reasons, I don't think the ZANU-PF government has the capacity to bring about any change. And I used to think that reform within ZANU-PF might bring certain changes, but I no longer do. What we need is a complete change. And at the moment, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, I actually think we do need a complete change of government and bring in fresh minds with fresh perspectives, with people who are at least in touch with the changes that have taken place and who are willing to try and reimagine a different kind of economic framework that would suit what Zimbabwe is currently experiencing at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nyamunda, for participating in these interviews. Thank you very much for your insightful and informative responses. I'm sure they will be of fundamental importance to our audience. I would want to invite you to like and follow the conversation on Facebook, and as well as to subscribe to the channel on YouTube. I'm going to try to invite as many academics who have written articles, who have written books, to have a discussion of these works and to have these discussions published so that the articles receive a viewership and a readership that is as big as can be possible. Thank you very much for participating and have a good day.
Thanks, Anu. It's always good talking to you.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, and all the best in the US there.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
All right then. Bye-bye.